and I'm going to give some context and then maybe address some of the larger issues and the way that it impacts not just movements but communities in I hate to compare, oppressions, but in a more difficult way, specifically the criminalization of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities in the US, but also regionally and globally. I think that Mohammed and David did a brilliant job, and Mohammed raised the point of the fact that, we don't often think about the reflex of responding and how powerful the reflex of responding is to claims of anti-Semitism. If not now, then maybe just a couple of years ago, versus the Palestinian need, for decades to literally beg and plead for recognition of anti-Palestinian discrimination and violence, not just in campuses, but in public schools. And we haven't really considered that. And I use the example of my experiences with some really vulgar sorts of discrimination growing up in the school system, in the public school system, right? One of my teachers actually forging my report card and failing me in only because of its anti-Semiticness. That narrow tactic is new, right? The narrowness of that tactic. The publicity with which the attempts to equate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the actual, to so expressly have this movement, right, to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is also new. And what's also new is the centralization of this push to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. It's not, it happens organically to some extent, but there is a really centralized movement to do this. And it's one that understands a lot of the dynamics that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But I think it helps us to kind of deconstruct a little bit of the power of the anti-Semitic label, right? And what it's really addressing. I mean, if you look at the idea or the theories of Orientalism and the power of Orientalism, well, the power really lied in defining the people, right? And once you've defined the people, how they behave, what they do, you've also assigned to them certain rights, right? And when you've defined a people, for example, the Palestinians, as inherently violent, useless, lazy, they had to wait for the Zionists to come in to make the desert bloom, all of these definitions, well, then you've also defined their rights, the parameters within which they're allowed to exist. And so anything beyond those parameters, any demand for rights beyond the rights that you've assigned to them, is itself then perceived as an act of violence, right? And so this is all for the purpose of subjugating the Palestinian people. But what does that really mean, right? Now flip it. What does that subjugation mean? Well, it means it's for the purpose of establishing Jewish supremacy, and not just Jewish supremacy, but specific kinds of Jewish people, Zionist Jewish supremacy. And so I think it's important that we start talking about that, right, is not just talking about the subjugation of the Palestinians, but this sort of supremacist society that is being created. It's not just a separatist society, but it's really a supremacist society. And the label of anti-Semitism works to preserve that power dynamic. That is the point. And to preserve that power dynamic, not just in Palestine, but to preserve that power dynamic here, where there's a reflexive response by those in power to the label of anti-Semitism, and the constant pleading by Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims and their allies for a recognition of the repression and censorship and discrimination that we experience under the institutions which are served by being in alliance with Zionism and the Zionist entity known as Israel. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. So we were talking about the purpose, right, and the power of definition. And again, I touched on the idea that this is not just limited to Palestinians, and certainly not at all limited to Palestinian students, but it really has subsumed the region. And in fact, much of the Arab region, the Arab people, the Muslim region, have largely been defined within the kind of, or been approached or treated within the Zionist framework, right? Their usefulness and their disposability, the usefulness of their resources and the disposability, their violence, so on and so forth. And what we're seeing now is the adoption of this framework and of this narrative, not just, in the US and in London and in Europe, but we're seeing it being adopted by the regimes in the MENA region, in the Arab and Muslim areas, right? With the increased public, right? There's always been a strong normalization in the region, but now we're seeing something very new, which is a public normalization of relationships between social and economic relationships between the Arab region and the Zionist entity called Israel, very publicly. As we saw in Jordan, we're seeing this coming from the Gulf. You're seeing also the proliferation of the same kind of narrative of your objection to Zionism and Zionist supremacy and Zionist Jewish supremacy is actually anti-Semitic. That's also being used as a tool to criminalize dissent or objection to Zionism in the region. So it's being adopted globally. I'm just going to have a sip of water. Now, of course, just as the Zionist networks, which have been critical to building and proliferating and really empowering the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim movement, you see the same thing in this, the labeling of anti-Semitism with Zionism. It's very much similar networks. They're identifiable networks that have kind of really launched this new movement to protect Zionism and protect Israel. It's an identifiable network, certainly funded by the usual suspects, from the Israeli government and its attachés and agents to the larger groups. Billions of dollars, right? But really, we should look at this kind of new focus, this narrow focus, this new angle. It's not a new angle, but the dropping off of all of the other angles, right? Because Palestinians and Arabs have not only been anti-Semitic, they've been what we've both been, which is jihadis and terrorists and Muslim extremists, right? The fact that all of these other labels are dropping off and what's left is just the label of anti-Semitism is actually a sign of the victory of the Palestinian solidarity movement and the retreat of the Zionist movement. So this is great news, as far as I'm concerned. Now we have the Canary mission and a couple of other missions. Well, 10 years ago, if you Googled me, you can probably pull up maybe 30 sites that were dedicated to calling me the whole myriad, right? The same thing, the Muslim terrorist, jihadi, Jew-hating, anti-Semitic. Well, now they're more centralized, right? So it's become a narrower, kind of more desperate, holding on to the last vestiges of the Zionist myth that has really supported Zionist supremacy, at least ideologically and morally. And that's what we're saying is the moral failure, the failure of the Zionists, the failure of Israel to hold the moral high ground any longer. And this is a great symbol of it, example of it. And Mohammed brought up, the lack of, the dissent, especially amongst the younger Jewish community. And I've witnessed this in the courthouses, and I'll talk a little bit about how anti-Semitism is manipulated and in fact instigated and fostered by the government, especially in New York, in coordination and in service to Zionist organizations in New York and nationally. But, what was I talking about? I keep doing that today, I'm quite tired. What was my point before that? The narrowness. There was a point that I was bringing up. Anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. The division, yeah. So, I've seen this in the courtroom, whereas, I'd say maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, if we were voir diring jurors, right, asking jurors questions so as to determine whether we're going to keep them on as jurors or not, right? And you would ask a question about Palestine or Israel or, Muslims or 9/11, and the response that you got was overwhelmingly a very PC, an attempted politically correct response at saying, well, the Palestinians, the Muslims, everybody, all of them, are just horrible. Whereas now, I've had, and it was just probably one of the best moments of my life, was watching these young potential jurors. I mean, it was the best and also probably the worst because they got themselves kicked off the jury. But, watching these young men and women who were also Jewish, or I'm assuming Jewish by the name, right? Actually, a couple of them identified as Jewish and used it to defend their positions during voir dire when asked about Palestine and Israel, specifically said, I'm against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and then went all out. And, one state, full liberations, the whole thing, the judge and the prosecution's jaws are like here, and here they are. I'm thrilled, but at the same time, I know that they're getting kicked off the jury. But, this is new, and it's wonderful, right? And it really speaks to, the power, I think, of not just social media, but of the student movement, but the young people, the young people's movement. So a little bit about the long history of anti-Semitism being used not just to murder Palestinians and to make disposable of Arabs and Muslims in general, but to criminalize them in the US. And this is, since the 1960s, this has been happening in the United States. You look at a lot of the early terrorism cases, especially after 9/11, so many of them focused on critiques, the defendant's critiques or the defendant's language vis-a-vis Israel and Zionism, right, or the Zionist entity. A lot of the cases really focused on that. Or interpreting the Quran to find the Quran itself as a whole, the entire religion, as anti-Semitic. And so they've already, indicted anybody how many are 1 billion Muslims, right? So even before you start your defense, this has already happened, right? The equation of anything remotely related or that might be in objection to Israel or remotely related to Arabs and Muslims as anti-Semitic is very old, right? And so we're constantly, which is, I think, part of the reason, Muhammad, why, there's an almost automatic credibility assigned to a lot of these claims of anti-Semitism, because a lot of us have kind of internalized, and when I say us, I really mean us, even us in the room, have kind of internalized, well, they're Arabs, they're Muslims, maybe, or even if by virtue of being Palestinian and having to deal with an entity that calls itself Jewish, oh, well, they're Palestinian, there's maybe, and that's maybe another conversation that we could have if we have enough time. I'm going to try to wrap up if we have time. Yeah, we'll have time. The instigation of anti-Semitic rhetoric by the NYPD is something which I'm really happy is being explored now. Aviva Stahl recently did an article regarding, the case of Ahmed Farhani, who was a mentally ill young man. A few people in this room were quite involved with his case, who was kind of set up and, was really goaded or instigated into saying anti-Semitic things by the NYPD undercover officer who totally set this up. And you see the same thing happening with the Newberg cases. You see the same thing happening with another man's case right after. Repeatedly, across the board, you see the NYPD and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is the FBI, goading people into articulating anti-Semitic remarks, really pushing the anti-Semitic line in order to get these terrorism convictions and these terrorism cases. And not just goading them into just parroting these words, but actually fueling anti-Jewish anger and rage. If you watch these exchanges, you watch the videos, I mean, you've got these people who are, and they're giving them anti-Semitic propaganda to watch oftentimes, right? And so they're planting this and they're creating this anti-Semitism, right? And it's done for the purpose of course, the natural, profitable purposes of funding Department of Homeland Security, NYPD security, so on and so forth, but it's also done in coordination oftentimes with Zionist groups, right? And the Zionist groups are somehow brought in, they monitor, they then come to monitor the trials, and then funding comes back into those communities for protection, right, from these fabricated, manufactured cases. So there's a whole industry that actually benefits from this creation of the fabrication of these terrorism cases. There's also the rendering of completely incredible as witnesses, in the courtrooms by accusations of anti-Semitism. And I actually had to be witness in a hearing. I witnessed an arrest, and I had to testify about that arrest for somebody who was not my client. And in an attempt to discredit me, the prosecution asked me about my Palestinian activism, right? And meanwhile, they're trying. The prosecutor, who's clearly an ardent Zionist, is attempting to have a conversation with her eyes with the judge. I'm sitting right next to the judge. I could see what you're doing, and then closes her line of questioning with a question. Her question simply was, "Do you consider yourself an anti-Zionist?" Right? And that was supposed to be, my death knell. The end of my credibility was whether I was an anti-Zionist. This is being asked on the stand, right? Now, the attorneys there were shocked. Well, I've handled enough Arab, Muslim, Palestinian cases to say I was not the least bit shocked. And this is something that I see all the time. On an assault case where the witnesses happen to be young Arab Muslim girls, right, who were actually attacked by the complaining witness, their credibility was attacked on the grounds, right, that they were Arabs. I mean, this is almost perfect. That they were Arab Muslim girls who happened to be part of a community center, right? And so the prosecutor tried to turn them as part of some type of sleeper cell, but then really close this out when he brought in, their relationships and conversations about Palestine, attempting to say that they were also, anti-Semitic by virtue of being anti-Zionist. Very overtly and over countless objections, all of which were overruled. Right? This is very commonplace in the courtroom. The number of arguments that I've had with judges, or one specific argument where in a civil case, a judge was essentially demanding it. We were having a hearing to establish whether my client was properly served and the case was initiated. And this is just a hearing, opposing counsel, the judge, lawyer, and a clerk. And I stated my case. My client has been living in Ramallah for the past 10 years. He was never properly served. Oh, counselor, where did you say your client was living? So I knew where this was going immediately, right? And then it was an exchange. She was basically trying to make me say that Ramallah was in Israel. Mm-hmm. And she kept, nope, that's not where Ramallah is, counselor. Well, according to the Department of State, Your Honor, And then when I, very nicely threatened her, right, with a complaint, she said, well, my friends call it Israel. And this is something that is very typical in New York courtrooms. Now, when the stakes are really high and a client is facing 20, 30, 40, 50 years, this is not something, that you can kind of shake off. It's not a civil case. And when it's, the core of the government's case, it's a problem. And the issue becomes, how do we do it? Right now, there's a more formal, the Sean Schrader case. Sean Schrader is a young man who came to the defense of a girl who was just in here. Where did she go, Nurdin? To a girl who was just in here. He came to her defense after she was attacked by two Israeli Zionists. I don't know if they're Israeli, one of whom happens to be a professor at Hunter. She was kind of physically attacked. They went to complain to the police that she was attacked, that she had her flag snatched. Everybody ignored them. Again, right? The aggressors called her anti-Semitic and said that she was a terrorist, at which point she was completely ignored. And it was the aggressors who were catered to and protected for the rest of the night. Sean went to her rescue, and then he's accused of hitting one of the aggressors, and a case is brought against him. Of course, in New York, if you've got somebody who's arrested outside of New York, it takes weeks to months to get them extradited, right? In this case, it took almost 48 hours from the time that charges were brought against him to bring Sean Schrader back into New York. 48 hours, 6 detectives. The hate crimes unit was deployed, all of whom the hate crimes unit thought it was outrageous that this was being treated as a hate crime, because it was clear that it was Nurdin who was the victim, and this had nothing to do with the fact that these people were Jewish. Well, initially, because of the differences between various sectors of the NYPD and the DA's office, there were no hate crimes charges brought. Enough pressure is brought on the case. The man is affiliated with the Zionist Organization of America. Fast forward 8 months, and now a simple assault case has now become a hate crimes case where this young man is facing serious time. But it's such a weak case that even the judge on the bench had asked the prosecution in my presence, well, you know, did you have a quota to fill with hate crimes? Because I don't understand. That's how. But Sean Schrader's is one of the first, I think, if not the first case in New York to attempt to criminally designate anti-Zionism as a hate crime itself. And it remains to be seen what happens. I'll leave it at that so we have some time for Q&A. Thank you, everybody.